Yeah, welcome from my side. Thanks, Sharad, for the introduction. A few additional words about me, actually, just as a heads up. So I'm not a robotics guy. So my mechanical engineering background is probably the closest that I get to robotics. And currently I'm doing my PhD in circular economy. And I work at the Fraunhofer ISI, where basically what we do is policy consultancy in the field of decarbonization of industry. What do I want to talk about today? So a few words about sustainability and the importance of products and product policies. So why to care about product sustainability? And I'm aware that this was covered during the last webinars, so I will keep that part short, but I still think it's important to have this as the baseline, also the motivation of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Then the second part is actually who cares about sustainability? So talking about the policy landscape and in particular the product regulation on EU level, and especially the eco-design directive, since this is my area of research. Then how to care about sustainability. So we learned already about LCA from Paula, so I extend a bit on that by the EU angle with the product environmental footprint. And lastly, a short example of batteries. And of course, I will try to put everything a bit into relation to robotics. This is overall, it is meant as an overview of what happens on the policy side for products on the EU level and why this is happening. So sustainability, it's a buzzword, but it's not new. So it was in 1966 that an US economist called Kenneth Boulding defined the term spaceship Earth as a metaphor for the finite resources which we have on the planet. And I like it. I think it's a good picture to realize that we are basically cutting down the tree on which we are sitting. And this discussion then started going and became a bit more concrete in 1972 with the Club of Rome, with the scenario analysis of what will happen if we continue current growth scenarios for population and resource use. And obviously, evidently, they found out that it's not really possible to maintain these growth trends. Actually, they did an update on this book 50 years later, and it showed that their earlier estimations were quite accurate. So how do we prevent that? I mean, I guess you all know sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. So we have this concept of intergenerational equity. And if we jump forward a few decades, then the concept of the planetary boundaries was introduced. I think Damien on his slide, he was also showing this briefly. So for different environmental impact categories like CO2, biodiversity loss, some researchers try to estimate what are the limits. And actually also, as Damien has shown, for several of those, we already are exceeding the safe operating space. The EU or the European Commission with the Joint Research Institute then wanted to find out how Europeans are actually contributing to this. And they developed the consumer and consumption footprint to estimate the impact of our consumption as Europeans. And the result is that we as Europeans exceed our share, and especially appliances have a large impact in that, especially in the impact categories of climate change and resource use, where we use up, as Europeans alone, 2/3 of the worldwide capacities. So sustainability, there are also social reasons of sustainability. You can care about future generations or about our global neighbors. There are economic reasons for sustainability. There's a high import dependency on many of the key materials which we need, for example, for the energy transition, also for robotics. So it's also possible to say that it's an economic risk to not be sustainable. So overall, there are environmental, social, and economic reasons for sustainability. And I mean, today in the webinar, we focus on the environmental side especially, but of course, everything is interrelated. And especially when we're talking about policies, we always have the economics at the back of the head, especially the economics. So I was checking a bit into robotics, and I found a nice publication, which is from the Joint Research Institute. It's from 2020, which basically shows which critical raw materials are used in different robotic parts. And this just to show that there's actually a lot of critical raw materials used in some form in the robotics sector. So making it very relevant to care about these aspects early on, and not when it is too late and we realize we do not have enough of those. So there was basically why to care about sustainability. So the environmental, economic, and social reasons. You can pick your favorite. And this brings me then to why care about it, to who actually care cares about it, and that's the EU landscape that I want to talk about. So I put here a few of the initiatives that are going on in the EU, and I will focus especially on the Eco-Design Directive, since this is my research area. So the Eco-Design Framework is basically a policy framework to regulate products with the goal to reduce their environmental footprint. And the focus so far has been mainly on the energy consumption of the use phase. So how much electricity is my fridge in my home consuming? And then under this Eco-Design Framework, we have individual product laws for each product group, in total 27 today. And I will quickly show which ones those are. So we have white goods as the category, so the big white things that are in your houses. We have lighting products, information and communication technology, heaters and coolers, and some others like vacuum cleaners or electric motors, which are of course also relevant for the robotics sector. We bring those into chronological order. Each bar here represents one legal document, and we count it in green if there are circular economy aspects in those legislations. And we evidently see that over time, this is increasing, showing that policymakers increasingly care about circular economy and sustainability beyond just the energy consumption in the use phase. The Eco-Design Directive is especially relevant today, and even especially relevant actually this week, since there's currently an update, which is called the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products, which includes then more products. So now we also, for example, textiles and furniture is included, which was before not, and there's the opportunity for stricter requirements. And actually earlier this week, there was the first agreement reached in the EU Council on this new regulation. And we see this on the left on the Twitter post from the German Secretary of State of the Economic Ministry. And yeah, on the right, we see that basically now, okay, we extend the product scale beyond energy-related products and also beyond energy consumption in the use phase. They make a specific notice of then also requirements like repairability and also the carbon footprint, what is especially interesting to what we're talking about today. So what does this tell us? Who cares about sustainability? The EU does. And of course, the decisions that are made on the EU policy level are influencing everyone, also companies, and also, of course, people in the robotics sector. Okay, if you now ask, but me as a company, as a researcher, how do I care about, or how do I measure sustainability? And we learned already from Paula that for the environmental dimension, there is a way with life cycle assessment. So it's a standardized way to assess the environmental impacts throughout the life cycle of a product. And as Paula discussed, there are different phases in the LCA. Also, I mean, you can use different databases for the environmental impacts, different software is there, but despite having this ISO standard, there's a lot of freedom still on how to do it, and it's not easy, as I think you learned already earlier in the presentations, which, yeah, it's making also difficult to compare different products. And what the EU then did, or the European Commission, they developed a more specified approach called the product environmental footprint, which basically tells you how to do an LCA beyond the ISO standards, so becoming more narrow. And by that, I mean, the goal is to increase the comparability. It is still based on the ISO standard, so you have it's basically a life cycle approach, and you have you can consider all the different life cycle stages in that analysis. It has the same phases, so you start with the goal and scope and move towards the interpretation of the results in the end. However, it is also more specific. For example, you have some default impact categories, so these are defined from the beginning. And I also put here the page numbers of on the one hand, the ISO standards and the product environmental footprint guide, which shows that it's just a longer document, providing a bit more details. And on top of that, it's not the product environmental footprint alone. In addition, you also have product-specific rules, which are then, now comes a long word, the product environmental footprint category rules, or PEP-CR, which are then specifically for one product group. So for example, they will define the relevant impact categories for batteries, and they say, okay, in your analysis, focus on these three because they are the most relevant for this product group. And also they define default data sources, like saying, okay, if for this data you cannot collect primary data yourself, so make some measurements in your factory that producing the batteries, then take these values so that it's more comparable. So what should you take from this? I think you should take that there is something to measure and maybe proceed, explore to at least find out which environmental hotspots are in your robotic systems. And this brings me then to the last part and the example of batteries. So batteries is interesting because the legislation is very advanced in terms of circular economy measures. There's a recent proposal for a new battery regulation, which is probably will be published or will enter into law this year. And in this proposal, they actually include a carbon footprint, which is very innovative and is not like going beyond what has happened for other product groups. So based on this, you could say that batteries are the front runner compared to other product groups, but maybe they are also rather chased. Why chased? They are chased by technological and material dependency and the European automotive sector being at risk with electric vehicles, because suddenly with this evolution from combustion engines to electric vehicles, the heart of the car, which used to be the combustion engine, now shifts to the battery, and there's a high dependency in Europe for that. Here we see that the technological dependency. So throughout the entire supply chain, there a lot is coming from Asia, from China and Japan, and from the raw materials, of course. I mean, lithium coming from Australia, but also a lot from South America, where the largest resources are, and the cobalt, over half of the worldwide resources are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the EU is completely dependent. And this brings me back to this ambitious legislation, where you could say that the legislators had to act because the battery sector, or in effect the automotive sector, was a bit too late to realize this trend. And then the EU now has to put a lot of pressure on the manufacturers towards circular economy with the aim to decrease this material dependency. So we get the materials back, which we have in the cars, and also to differentiate EU batteries as, or label them as the green batteries, to kind of create a competitive advantage or unique selling point for European batteries, to kind of help this industry to be built up in Europe. So in the end, these ambitious circular economy and sustainable policies can be seen as a way to protect the automotive sectors. And yeah, so this may be the message for robotics sector. It makes sense to consider sustainability early on, become a front runner. And I think the examples of what we heard already of innovators like Seppe with the self-healing materials, also Damien with the eco-design for robots, show that this is already happening in parts. And I think it can be also framed very positively that this can be the competitive advantage and global competitive advantage of the EU to be more sustainable than the others. And this leads me to end with the picture of the vision, or maybe it can be. And thank you very much for your attention. This is my contact information, and here some sources which you can check later in the video.